ridiculously crazy the energy in that sound is. Today I'm going to show you how to make an insane beat, or lots of insane beats, with free or stock plugins, and demonstrate how you can create something really special without spending lots of money on all the expensive plugins and VSTs. I could make a video using only stock plugins from FL Studio, but I want this to help anyone, whether you're working in FL Studio or Ableton or any other DAW. And not everybody has access to all of the plugins within FL Studio, especially if you haven't bought the producer bundle or the signature bundle, whereas anyone can use free plugins. And I'll preface this by saying that just because something is free or stock, it does not mean that it is not industry standard or very professional. I definitely recommend checking out all the free plugins that I mentioned listed down below in the description. The expensive plugins and VSTs certainly still have a very important place, and there are some things that you just can't beat and they're worth paying for, but it doesn't mean that you can't make something really amazing only using stock and free plugins. You just have to be a little bit more skillful and creative. I'll show you what I've put together and then I'll dive into a breakdown. And if you like this video, if you want to see more things like this, just let me know down below in the comments. And I won't ask you all to like, share, comment, subscribe, unless of course you actually find the video valuable.
Taking every part of me, endless, and I still feel the hurt it all somehow. It's still so beautiful. As far the eye can see, endless, and I still feel the waterfall somehow. It's still so colorful. Taking every part of me, endless, and I still feel the waterfall somehow. It's still so beautiful.
Has to be one of the craziest sounds I've put together so far. Okay, so let's dive into the breakdown. For almost all of my projects, I'll start with a template. It just means that my creative flow is much faster. I can put down ideas much quicker and be way more creative with my signal flow, with separating different signals, and I will dive into how I do that later on. It means that my mixer is all set up. I couldn't possibly do all of this every time I set it up, so the template is an absolute lifesaver, and I will probably make a video about it in the future and maybe even make it available on my Patreon if you guys are interested. So despite it looking quite complex, I actually tried to keep it all very simple overall. I usually start with a chord progression, which I made here with this lead sound. And I just use Vital as one of the free synths that I can't recommend enough. The fact that it's free blows my mind still. It's very similar to Serum, and you could probably do something similar with 3x Oscillator, which is one of the stock plugins within FL Studio. This is what the lead looks like inside Vital, but I struggle to play it right now because it's quite CPU intensive. Ways to get around that are maybe to use some other less CPU intensive synths, which for example in FL Studio there is Harmless, Harmer, or Citrus. Those all do a pretty decent job. Or you just design your sound and then print it out to WAV file like I've done up here. I then used a couple different techniques, which I'll dive into later on, to separate out the dry and wet signals so that I could have this really nice luscious pad in the background along with the melody. Then I did very similar things but with a piano from Labs and from Spitfire Audio, the Labs free piano, which again is linked down below. I stuck with the same chord progression and went for a light plodding with the same sort of rhythmic texture, but used a lot of automation with gross beat and with some reverb and other effects to try and make it all blend nicely with that initial pad sound and go from being high end to the octave down using gross beat. And again, I'll dive into those techniques later. I'm just explaining the basic structure of the beat for now. This is also the order that I put it all together in. For the drums, most of the samples that I used came from the Sikky Beats Pandora free sample pack, which is just an incredible selection of sounds. And of course, there's a paid for version with an even larger number of awesome sounds, but the sounds from the free version are so high quality. It's been one of my favorite packs to go to. But of course, not all of the sounds were. Some of them were just the stock FL Studio sounds, like the shaker. And there are loads of high quality sounds, even just within the stock FL bank. There are also lots of other drums available for free online. Companies like Cymatics have a massive range of free drum sounds, which are all really high quality. For this track, I wanted to keep the drum patterns actually very simple and just be bold with the sounds that I used. So the kick, snare and hat are the main drivers of it, and then I just have some shakers and reverse shakers to emphasize the movement of the drum pattern, and then just some very simple but really cool effect sounds. And in certain sections, I was also trying to harness silence as a sound just as much as I was using other sound effects. And that's very easily overlooked, but actually very powerful. It's not just about the stuff you're putting in, it's also when are you taking the stuff away. The final element that I added in was this sub bass here. That's one of my favorite bits. The way that I designed this again was within Vital, and I just used essentially 3 different sine waves with slightly different alterations in the wavetable position. It's just from a sound that I designed myself, and you could definitely create something similar to this just using 3x oscillator, but I just prefer the interface of Vital, and it's just much easier to make a creative and unique sound with Vital, and of course it's free. It's difficult to play it without the computer really struggling, especially because there are 3 oscillators playing all at once, but I will try. That's just what the raw sound is, and it's just, like I say, 3 different sine waves moving along the wavetable here, and just different amounts of filtering. And then in the effects, I've just got some really strong hard clip distortion, and then use a multiband compressor just to pull up those frequencies in a way that was desirable. And the whole goal with that sound was to give it as much character and grit as possible without it being overbearing, and I will get into that in a second. And the last element, of course, were the vocals. Now the vocals, I didn't have only stock plugins and free plugins on, because I just wanted to focus on making the beat with only stock and free plugins, but I can make a dedicated video in the future explaining how I would process vocals if I were only using free or stock plugins. My usual vocal chain comprises of a lot of stock plugins like parametric EQ, fruity compressor, and then I use these sends to go to hall reverb, plate reverb, and a delay. And then also Fruity Balance, which is one of my favorite plugins. I use it all the time to control volumes, do gain staging, and that's another thing that I can make specific videos on in the future if you're interested. The stock FL plugins that are my favorite, I would say, are parametric EQ2, especially given the new update. I just love using that, and I don't really use many other EQs ever. I just use that one most of the time. There is a time and a place for other EQs that are a little bit more creative and more interesting, but for the most, I use that parametric EQ2 for everything. And then Fruity Compressor is another one that I just gravitate towards all the time. It just does good things, and it's pretty simple to use. Fruity Reverb is another one of my favorite stock plugins that I just gravitate towards all the time. And then of course I've got Fruity Delay, which is another perfect stock plugin for the delays on the vocals. One of the other reverbs that I often gravitate towards, which is more of a combination between reverb and delay, is Valhalla Supermassive, which is another great free plugin, and I use that for the instrument lead sounds here. And I often throw that on the vocal as well, just because it makes a slightly more creative sound than the standard Fruity Reverb 2. That was the basic composition. I tried to keep the core sounds and structure very simple, and the creativeness and the interest in the sound came from all of the techniques I will dive into now. And I find that they are really helpful at making really simple, minimal sounds very interesting. And that helps massively, especially if the sound that you start off with perhaps isn't high enough quality. For example, take FL keys, just a basic key sound within FL Studio. Doesn't really sound that great on its own, but if you apply several of these different techniques, you can turn it into something that sounds ace. First technique is making sure that I always keep my dry and wet sounds separate from each other. The dry sound being the raw initial sound that's coming either from the recording or from the VST, and then the wet signal being the reverb, delays, other effects like that. By separating those two signals out, you can have separate control on either of them, and you can either completely remove one or the other and automate them up and down so that they are kind of dancing with each other. You can EQ and compress them separately, and you can also add width to one of them whilst keeping the other one in the middle. Take the lead sample that I started with initially. I have the dry signal of this turned completely off, so that all you're really hearing is the reverb and the delay. If I play it right now, you don't actually hear any of the dry signal. I have to go into my instrument effect here and turn it up. Now that's a really cool sound, and I really liked all of the texture that it had initially, but I thought, yeah, it's gonna be way too powerful if I just leave it on its own, and it doesn't really leave much space up in that high-end frequency, particularly for things like vocals, high-end drums, and so on. So I knew that I would want to keep that raw signal with all of its character. Instead of taming that raw signal, just turn it down or turn it off, but make sure that that signal is being sent to the reverb. And that means that your reverb and your delay will still have all of that richness coming from the raw sound, but it's much more tamed and controlled, and it leaves a lot more space for all the other sounds. I set that up by having the main mixer track here, and then using Fruity Send, I'll add a Fruity Send for the reverb and for the delay on that main mixer track. Sidechain those two to a separate reverb and delay channel here. So within the Fruity Send, I will then open that up and click Send to the reverb, and then within the delay, I will click Send to the delay, so that I now have complete control over the reverb and the delay separately, and the dry lead sound if I want to. On the reverb, I'm using Fruity Reverb as the main one, and turn the dry signal of that reverb down completely so that all you hear is the wet reverb. I then threw on Valhalla Supermassive too, just to make it a little bit more creative. I can then EQ that reverb how I would like to. I can then also throw a gross beat onto there, or I can throw a gross beat onto the effects bus so that I'm controlling gross beat on the delay and the reverb. That all comes from separating out the dry and wet signal. And I did the same thing within the piano. So as you can see here, I have the main labs piano here, but then I also have a piano effects channel here where I've got the same setup with Fruity Reverb 2, all the dry signal turned off, and then Valhalla Supermassive. By separating it out though, it means that I can keep some of the low end in the main piano sound, like I've got here. So there's the dry piano sound all on its own. And I can keep the nice lower frequencies, especially when this part comes in later on. Because there's still quite a lot of information down there that I want, but with the reverb, I don't want that. I just want it to be a nice shimmer up in the high end. So by having that over here, I can have a much more aggressive cut on the reverb there too. I could even automate this so that it comes up and down, but I didn't need to do that this time round. With the vocals, that technique works really well too. So I have my main vocal here, which is dry, and then I've sent it to 2 different reverbs and a delay. Then I will bus these effects together here, and then I can automate that up and down so that in certain sections I can have a nice big luscious reverb, and then I can turn it all back down again. That means you can go from having a vocal that feels really wide and spacious to a vocal that feels very intimate and close right up in your ears. So that when I say the word endless, it goes endless and opens right up into this big space. And then when it goes, I still feel, it's really small and intimate back in your ears again.
Me endless, and I still feel the hurt it all somehow. It's still so beautiful.
And then I cut them right away. Then, because you've separated out those signals, there's a lot of creative things that you can do with the wet signal. In this lead, I took the wet signal from the lead in the instrument effects here. I would open up an Edison and actually record. I'll give you an example of this. So I would click. So I'm recording in the wet signal, so the reverb and the delay from that lead sound into the instrument effects. Then you can do lots of creative things within the Edison. For example, you could highlight it, press Ctrl B, and then you can turn the amount right up, and this gives you a nice blur, which creates really lovely pads. Then you can take that down like I have done here. I'll pitch it down 12 semitones so that it's an octave lower. And reverse it too, and that makes it a really luscious, nice sound from that original, very aggressive lead sound. I do this with vocals, with pianos, with almost anything. I always find it really interesting to see what a sound will sound like when you run it through that processing. And I'm always a sucker for a luscious pad. It just goes such a long way, but by having instruments like that, it's not so dominant. Then to control that sound even more, I will then sidechain the kick of the drums and the snare to the instrument effects bus so that that sound is being ducked really aggressively. Speaking of using dry sounds that are really aggressive and then using the wet sounds, another way that you can create things like that is having dry sounds that are almost way too overbearing and too powerful on their own, and then using EQ to control those sounds. For example, this monstrous sub bass that I have here, I'll play you this sound on its own without any of the EQ on it. I love the energy that it had, but if it was like that all the way through the song, I just think it would have been way too overpowering. So of course, using parametric EQ and a couple of other different effects, I could just control that sound so that it wasn't quite so aggressive. So you've got this monster, but it's being controlled a little bit, like only just. It feels like there's this crazy monster that's trying to break through. And sometimes, obviously later using automation, I would let it break through for a moment and then it would all cut back down again. And of course, the way that I would do that is using automation. And I find it really easy to do when I've got my template set up like this, so that if I want to turn anything up and down, it's very quick. I can just select something, for example, within the instruments. If I want to turn the instrument effect volume up and down, I'll just use this fruity balance, which I'll already have loaded up in my template. I'll just right click on it and then click create automation clip, and it will jump straight into the playlist, and then I can do what I want with it. I can break all that stuff down in more detail in the future, but essentially I use automation clips all the way throughout to make it much more creative and to make sounds that without the automation would just become overpowering and almost tiring to listen to, like this bass, which is a perfect example. Actually then means that that sound now becomes viable within that beat because you're controlling it a lot more. So when you look at the EQ here within this bass, that's how I get it to be that aggressive, because most of the time I'm controlling that sound, but every now and again I'll just let it run completely loose and it's awesome. Within Within Vital, there are also some great filters and EQ options within there, and I would definitely have used those if my computer could handle doing it all at once, but at the moment I find it easier to print the signal out and then just use parametric EQ to control it all. That's one of the other great things about using the stock plugins, is that most of the time they're very low intensity CPU usage. And the last stock plugin that I use, which I find is really great, and although it can be a little bit cliche, I still think it's a really awesome tool within FL, is Gross Beat. And I use it in two different ways. I used it to create a gate for certain sounds to stutter, and then I also use the classic halftime on the piano. So as you can see here, I've got the halftime on here, but I automate the halftime up here so that it's off to begin with, and it gradually fades up. So at the end of this phrase, the piano has submerged into this darker, lower sound. I then also use the pulse to make the sound stutter. And this is what it looks like. And then I liked that effect that much that I copied it across onto the bass and also onto the lead. But by having them separate, I could control them so that they would go up and down whenever they wanted to. That's what I used to make that really cool pulse here. But you've got to be careful with that technique not to overuse it. That's where the automation comes in really handy, because if it was stuttering all the time, it would just be annoying. But because it does it in certain sections, it can make it much more tasteful of a technique. One of the ways that I find it's helpful to test how useful stuttering certain things are going to be is to actually just throw Gross Beat or parametric EQ onto your master and just affect your master chain, just to give you a rough idea of what that's going to sound like to different sections of your song. So initially, that's exactly what I which is really cool. It works really well, but of course I wouldn't want it to do that all the way through, and so by testing it there first, I could then decide where I thought it would suit best, which was on the instruments, the bass and the piano. I really hope you found them all helpful, and if you need any more advice or if you want me to dive into any specific thing in more detail, just leave a comment down below or send me a message. I would love to hear from you. So that was that. I really hope you found this video valuable. If you have any further questions or queries, just leave them down below in the comments or send me a message on my Instagram. I'd love to hear from you. And of course, believe in yourself and you will be unstoppable. I will see you in the next video. I look forward to that, and you can probably click on one of those right now, but until then, bye.
It's still so beautiful.